Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. We come to you every Sunday evening on MNN at 8 p.m., and the show is repeated every Thursday evening at 8. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York City. I'm so happy to have you along for what I know will be one of the most enlightening and important shows we've done as we attempt to imagine and help bring about a radically new, compassionate world of justice, fairness, and love. Part of the radical imagination that progressives often ignore are attempts to engender a political movement that publicly says we want a different kind of world. A world in which love and generosity are the foundations of our public life together. A movement that affirms hope and the highest values of the human race, against the voices of cynical realism and fear. It challenges the left for its inability to understand the centrality of religious, moral, and spiritual concerns in the lives of ordinary Americans. A spiritual crisis is at the heart of any possible political transformation of America. But for the traditional political left, the religious belief system and organized religion was an expression of man's imperfect self-awareness and was a distortion of his true nature. It developed because society was distorted by the human condition, and particularly distorted by the economic relations that made him think religion was indispensable to his life and existence. Religion was the opiate of the suffering masses that kept them from their true nature and self-emancipation. It was a degradation of our humanity that fostered a false consciousness and hindered real happiness and freedom that can only be achieved through a class-based economic revolution. We see it differently. We imagine a movement that would not be an explicitly religious movement, but it does include a spiritual and moral vision that had been the common wisdom of humanity for most of recorded history. It includes people of goodwill from whatever political, religious, or humanist tradition. And it would realize that people's need for a moral meaning and center is just as intense as their need for economic security. The spiritual values and social ideas of love, generosity, kindness, nonviolence, caring, and open-hearted awe and wonder at the beauty and mystery of life in the world are the emancipating and liberating affirmations of life that need to be included in any vision of building a better world. Yet all of this is rarely, if ever, discussed in America's public institutions, including certainly not in our schools and universities or in the social sciences, where so many of the policies and programs impacting on so many people are developed and promoted. But now this is beginning to change. I'm thrilled to introduce our guest this evening, who along with Cornel West has been at the cutting edge of teaching a profoundly important and necessary course on radical love. And I've been blessed and privileged to sit in on the class at Union Theological Seminary this semester. And believe me, it's a game changer. It needs to be taken seriously all across the academy and become part of a much larger dialogue all across American culture. David is a professor and chair of the Religious Studies Department, associate professor in American Studies at Connecticut College. Welcome, David, to the Radical Imagination. I'm so glad you're here to help enlighten us about radical love.
Thank you, Jim. What a beautiful introduction, my goodness. And I want to commend you and Stanley Aronowitz. Both of you are long-distance runners in the progressive movement, and to foreground the need for the radical imagination as an animating principle and way of being for the movement is absolutely, absolutely necessary. So thank you. And we, Cornel, are so blessed to have you in the course as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much. tell me how this course got started and how you got involved in this.
Right. Yeah. So, Cornel is, of course, one of my closest friends, but he was first my teacher and my mentor in graduate school. This was well over 20 years ago. And I guess last fall, I came to visit a class he was teaching on Du Bois at Union Theological Seminary. And we just reminded each other of what it was like to be in the classroom together. Just a certain kind of intellectual camaraderie, a certain kind of spiritual solidarity, a certain kind of intellectual vitality that I think we were both curious about what it would be like to be in the same space, in the same pedagogical space. And so, Cornel said, why don't you come down, on a Tuesday evening in the fall and teach a course together. And we came up with the title of Radical Love, right? This theme, this idea that has been animating really both of our lives and works, for a very, very long time.
It's the first time you've taught the course, is that it?
Yeah, this is the first time.
Wow.
Yeah.
And again, there's so much to talk about when one talks about love. And so, what do you mean when you talk about radical love? How is it different than non-radical love, if you will?
Well, the radical part of it was to foreground the ways in which love operates and permeates our lives, and yet it seems to have the status that is underdeveloped, underappreciated. And so the radicalism of radical love is for us to have a kind of a 14-week long meditation, a collective meditation dialogue about what it is that love does in politics, in culture, in our social lives, in our personal lives, such that it would transform our lives in ways that we don't quite yet understand, right? So love is such an important and central feature of the human condition, and it's a remarkable thing and kind of sad thing about our times, where people don't talk freely and self-consciously about love, right? And I think one of the things that we aspire to in the class and in the dialogue, and you've seen this in the class, is to try to break the language and discourse of love open, and to kind of reawaken and reimagine its place in our lives.
I was so, I don't know, stunned is the word, but I was so amazed that I remember the first couple of weeks, several of the students were just so open to the subject matter and weren't sure what it would be about and what place love placed in their world. And these are seminarian students. So
they're hungry, right?
They're hungry for it, and we all are. And again, you make this point very early on in the class, to talk about love in essentially a loveless world. We need it. It's profoundly important. And yet, why is it so lacking?
Well, I mean, you just use the example that you started off in your setup, right? If you think about left progressive politics as wanting to advance a certain kind of human welfare, human well-being, and yet increasingly, perhaps because of its secularization or secularism, perhaps because of its detachment from a certain kind of affective resources, left politics had become increasingly instrumental, as much of American politics is, right? So, treating people as means and not ends, right? Treating people as commodities, right? To instrumentalize lives, and to instrumentalize politics. And if you think about the instrumentalization of politics, which is to say that it's just trying to get you somewhere as opposed to create flourishing, as opposed to, again, contribute to our well-being, that's going to contribute to a sense of lovelessness. Now, there are all sorts of other forces operating in the world, right? The rabid consumerism, and the kind of, let's call it the cheapening of the language of love, right? I mean, popular culture is filled with love talk, but it's not filled, in my view, with a deeply affective, engaged heart. And so, when I talk about the loveless world that we're in now, it's not that there isn't love there, but it isn't as pronounced and as foregrounded as it ought to be, right? As it might be, and it's I don't want to say it's an uphill battle, but it's an attempt to kind of convert people, to try to open up their minds, open up their consciousness in a way where they say, love is a resource for the political. Love is a resource for progressive politics.
An
love is
a narrative.
It's a narrative, right?
Another way.
And it has transformative possibilities, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've had James Gilligan on, the psychiatrist,
right.
who also thinking outside the box. Why are we so focused on punishment and caring and tenderness and rehabilitation and so on within our mental hospitals and prisons and so on? So again, this cuts through the economic, the political structure, and so much of the social sciences is not anywhere in terms of.
Yeah, I mean, the social sciences, our contemporary social sciences and modern social science, as you know, is predicated on prediction and control.
Right. Quantification.
Right. Quantification.
Putting
and so,
truth into data.
Right, and so how do we understand individual, collective, cultural behavior in a way where we can predict ends and anticipate the behavior in a way where, if there's a social problem, if there's a social challenge, we're there, right? We have the numbers, we have the data. And yet, at times, not all social sciences, but I think this is the trend that you're talking about. At times, it feels like social science is studying phenomena that is not inhabited by real people.
Right. The data becomes the reality.
Yeah, and it shapes a reality, right? I mean, if you think about what real people care about, what animates them in their daily lives, of course they want to eat, of course they want to protect their own, but we all need love. We all need affection. We all need the experience of both receiving care and caring for others. And we understate and underplay that as a priority, and really at our peril.
Now, run through some of the theological foundations for the course.
For the course.
You have a section on the Jewish prophetic tradition. And so tell us a little about that in terms of some of the foundation.
Yeah, I mean, the not so secret undercurrent of the course is the Black freedom movement, right?
Right.
And so much of the Black freedom movement was driven by Black religion, as it is now. And so amongst the theological undercurrents, as you were calling it, or trends there. We've focused on folks like Martin Luther King, but Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and also the deep roots of those traditions. Whether it's Augustine or the social gospel movement, right? We spent a bit on Walter Rauschenbusch. We've tried to, not in a fully adequate way, but in a way that would expose the students to different traditions. So we've looked to the Jewish traditions, the prophetic traditions, particularly someone like Abraham Joshua Heschel. There it's less about love and more about the ethical orientations that might open up the space of love. We looked at Buddhist traditions of compassion, of mindfulness, of bearing witness. Folks like Thich Nhat Hanh, Bernie Glassman, Charles Johnson, the great writer Charles Johnson. And actually this week, as you know, we're going to be looking at Malcolm X, right?
But the religious overtones, the theological overtones, come out of trauma, catastrophe, of oppressed people, in the case of Jewish prophets.
Right.
Is that a necessary component of radical love?
Well, one could argue that you don't have to go searching for the catastrophic, it's already here, right? And so given the widespread permeation and pervasiveness of the catastrophic in our lives, if that's a precondition for radical love, we're very ripe for it, right? We're in the midst of ecological catastrophe, we're in the midst of moral catastrophes, we're in the midst of political catastrophes, social catastrophes, which is to say that this constant state of crisis, which is modern humanity, is in need of salves, is in need of breaks from the catastrophic. Right? And so the catastrophic isn't something that you will solve in a moment. The catastrophic isn't something that we're going to have a silver bullet and say, it's done. We need ways to survive the catastrophic, but also ways in which our humanity can show up in the catastrophic, even as we're being beat down.
as you've written, right, how one organizes oneself around loss and catastrophe. And that's, of course, what Heschel talks about when he loses his entire family. And in the face of all that, how does one still love?
Well, you sometimes, in the case of Heschel or that tradition, the Jewish tradition, it's when there is nowhere else to go, right? This sense of having lost everything, or a sense that having lost everything, and then finding when you have glimmers of hope, and it may be the hope that there's some survival, some companionship to be had. You know,
some traditions.
Yeah, there are traditions, but the traditions to go back to,
but
also
collective memories.
Yeah, the collective memories, but the collective memories that shape behavior, the collective memories that in which families and peoples structure their lives. So again, the Jewish tradition of a certain kind of ethics of humility, right? In which the benefit of the other, that those who are suffering, need to have a higher priority than oneself. What is that?
More often than any other.
That's right. And what does it do? And it reveals to us, and it relativizes our own sense of stress and need. Now, I think the experience of the catastrophic isn't one in which you say to folks, well, love well. Part of what we're trying to figure out in working through this idea of radical love is to say, can you discern hope and light in the darkness, right? And the hope and light in the darkness, again, can be small things. It doesn't have to be a grand gesture of love, right? It can be the tenderness of someone offering you a morsel of food. It can be the care in which you open a door for somebody, right? The small gestures are indices of a heart-filled way of being in the world, which is often obscured. In the catastrophic, it's this dramatic way. But I think in our times where, we live in especially irreverent times. We live in especially, I might even call them impolite times, right? Let alone impolitic times, right?
Callous, rude.
Yeah, they're callous, and it's, and I would actually call them cynical, right? And the cynicism in which many of us live, that shapes so much of how we are socially, again, is a mark of a certain kind of heartlessness, right? Where cynicism is what? It's a kind of separation from the world, right? It's saying like, oh, I don't really care. I can't really put my heart here, right? There's a distance. There's a gapping there. Radical love says what? You need to close the gap at every opportunity.
Take the chance.
Take the chance. That's a beautiful way of putting it. Take the chance. Take the risk of actually closing the gap and perhaps actually experiencing love.
So it's the sphere of intimacy also that is very much part of the lack of radical love really appearing.
Well, it's intimacy, but it's the need for intimacy, but also think about the ways in which we're so guarded with each other, right? I mean, you talked of solidarity in your opening in the progressive movement. I think solidarity without mutual affection, solidarity without affiliation, in the sense of brotherliness or sisterliness, is a weak solidarity, right? Because why? Your heart and your souls are not in the common project.
It's an intellectual game.
Yeah, that's right. Right, and so something like the radical imagination. I'm guessing that you and Stanley engaged in this in part because you saw the left as kind of repeating a failure of imagination.
Polarizing, narrow.
Yeah, it's polarizing,
rigid.
Kind of limited horizons, dreaming small, not big and grand.
And that's why, relatively speaking, it's still feeble.
Oh, yeah. Right, because it doesn't capture people's imaginations.
Right. But this, as you point out, is an opportunity because the catastrophic is all around us, and we pretty much are getting the same old cynicism.
Right.
On the right, in the center.
Well, but do you sense a hunger on the left?
Absolutely. Well, on the left.
Well, I get a general sense of a hunger for people to talk about love,
Yeah.
even just to begin to talk about it such that they say like, oh, here are all these aspects and elements of my life that have not been played out in public. They have not been played out in politics, or the ways in which they've been played out in politics have been determined from external sources, right? The kind of polemics we're hearing from Donald Trump now, right, or Ben Carson, right, where, that's kind of red meat politics, right? It's not blood-filled politics. I mean, in the sense of like, the blood that courses through our love. But it's the stuff that makes people crazy, right? It speaks to their frustrations in a cheap way, right? As opposed to frustrations that are animated by heartbreak, right? I think one of the things that the left could really, let's say, take advantage of.
Say that again?
One of the things that the left could take advantage of are to speak to people's frustrations in a way where it doesn't fold over into cynicism, but it folds over into things like compassion. It folds over into things like mercy. It folds over into things, or transforms into things like public love.
I don't know about your students. I've found my students very much would like to go there, but don't have the confidence or history that there was anything besides wars on drugs and wars on terrorism, wars on crime, and mass incarcerations, John Jay. But I think I've talked a good bit about this course in criminology classes, and it opens things up, but they're still defensive about it. They said, well, they did this to us, and how? Of course, we've got to hit them back and harder.
Right.
And that goes on, and the cycle of violence and mistrust and cynicism continues. And
but you said two interesting things there. No, you said several interesting things, but two of the things I'm going to pick up on. One is confidence. And which is connected to a confidence of will, but also a confidence of imagination, right? So what I just heard at the end there is your students are saying, well, nothing's going to change, so we have to, we give back what we get, right? We give as good as we get, as opposed to saying, well, what if we actually step back and say, well, we don't want to partake in that old game, and actually trying to reshape and reframe what meaningful politics is, where it's not driven by self-interest primarily, right? But there's a sense in which mutuality is a first principle, right? So imagine a politics, imagine a culture that says your welfare is as important to me as my own, right? And that my welfare is predicated on you doing well, right? Imagine a politics like that.
And I do feel most of humankind would rather go that route if the circumstances allow them.
What's a contingency?
What's the structure?
Yeah, what's the contingency that you're thinking is that it's not there?
Moral courage. They don't see their elders or those in authority. They're turned off. They know it's a game. They know that they're not serious. They've been gamed in their education. And yet, there's nothing else they can do, or that's the feeling, the fatalism, and they put up with it and going to try and survive, and it's a horrible existence.
It is, and that's I often tell my students that's a failure on us silverbacks. If we appear in the world, if we teach them, if we engage in the world in a way where we appear insincere. We may talk a big game, but the way we live our lives is inconsistent. Shame on us, right? Shame on us. And so, you're pointing to the generations is incredibly important. There's a thing happening, as you see now on college campuses, right, with the protests.
Yeah,
right?
I wanted to get to that.
There were these protests, and it's something that I could not have predicted. I don't think any of us would have predicted 5 years ago, right? That the students would erupt and emerge on the campuses. And what's happening is that, it's like the students of color, particularly the black and brown students, are saying enough. The generations before us would lump it and eat these things, But for us, it's enough. It's too much, right? And it's not just obviously on the campuses, right? You know, what's happening on the streets with the police and the abuse, what's happening in
the grinding down of people in their lives economically.
It's a grinding down, but it's also, you know, this
humiliation.
And it's this collective confession of racism. It's this collective confession of the ways in which, you know, there is so little mutual regard in the world. You know, so the students, you know, you see these signs on campuses now, where black and brown students are holding up signs that say, "I am loved." Imagine that, right? An anti-racism protest, and the sign, the big declaration they're making is, "I am loved." That's a profoundly different statement about racism and white supremacy than even its previous generation, Because it's saying what? Racism is primarily a statement of hate. Racism is primarily a statement that says, I am questioning your humanity. I'm questioning your worthiness for love. And imagine this profound insight and wisdom that is coming up from these students, these young folks. You know, to me, this is a tremendous sign of hope.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Black Lives Matter, of course, is at the center of that.
You know, and that is a love. Well, it is aspiring to be a love-driven movement, right?
We've had a couple of members on the show here, and it seems.
And what have they said?
Well, it's quite a decentralized, disparate movement, so it's hard to get any sort of unified picture about it. But I don't know how much love really. I mean, self-love. Or attempts to deal with racism, as you say, I am loved. I'm loved, and you're not going to tell me otherwise. Right. I think that's.
But again,
that's
like remember,
part of it.
So what's embedded in that phrase? I am loved. I am worthy of love. Right. I mean, I think one of the things about Black Lives Matter, the movement, or at least strands in the movement. Let's not speak about the whole thing, right? But the strands of the movement are pronouncing love as not just the aspiration, but the precondition for blackness, right? The precondition for fighting against racism, right? Which is to say, you know, if racism is constantly questioning the humanity of people of color and subjugating people of color in a way where it's hard to imagine being loved, right? Think about what that says about our world. Think about what that says about our culture.
So this is a profound step to resist that, potentially again, and could also get a blowback and backlash, of course, and how dare they stand up in this way. And that's another question I was going to ask you, too. I want to ask you, there's no way of predicting where all this energy might go in terms of the social movement, what form it might take, because hurt people can hurt others, and often do. So I think that one of the real issues is to how to garner this energy and channel it in a productive way that other people can relate to and build broader-based movements that can transform the larger economic, political system. And do you see any hope in the Bernie Sanders?
Well, I think you see some of that in Bernie Sanders' campaign. But I think, you know, one of the things that the progressive movements, and let's call it plural, right, progressive movements have to do is to affirm each other, right? So the anti-racism folks have to affirm the folks working on climate change and understand the connections and systematic connections between them, right? The war on terror being connected to you know, climate change as well. You know, I was thinking about this yesterday, or I guess it was Sunday. You know, there was a ban on protests in Paris after the terrorist attacks there. And so it's a tremendous combination of art and savvy politics and let's just call it public love, where in the Place de République, 10,000 pairs of shoes were put there, you know, because the government said you can't protest. So all the protesters put out all these shoes there, right? To say we are present even when we're not there, right? Even the Pope sent a pair of his shoes, right? And then amidst them, this group of women dressed as angels appeared. And they were just there the day before the climate change talks, holding up signs. They were silent, but just, appealing to a sense of, you used the words earlier, a sense of awe, right? A sense of connection, a sense of higher purpose, right? Imagine angels alighting to us and saying, this is good work. This is necessary work. In terms of a wider spread global movement, I think it's going to be more episodic, right, than that. But we have to trust people that even in their episodic movements of resistance and insisting on their humanity, insisting on radical imagination and radical love and change, that's going to
radical love is, as you point out in the class, so messy.
That's right.
And never
That's
predictable.
Right. That's right. That's right. As is actual politics, right? As is actual life is messy. I mean, we were talking about this earlier with the social scientists. Social science has a really tough time with messiness, right? I mean, you use the metaphor of the box a few times, right? It doesn't fit in a box, a container, a quantifiable way of understanding the world. So much of our experience, so much of our individual experience, so much of our collective experience exceeds any of the categories, right? We use them as markers to understand, to communicate and such, but, a good deal of life is messy and funky, right?
Exactly. But it's so easy to pacify this emerging embryonic feelings, to commodify them.
I see.
As they,
Right.
did with the hippie
Right.
subculture of the
Right.
60s.
Right.
Make love,
Co-opt, domesticate, and so on.
Music
Right.
gets, shifted around and again, commodified in a way that loses its real spirit, and that it seems like it's pretty simple to do that, isn't it?
It is. I mean, especially given this widespread preoccupation with celebrity culture, this widespread preoccupation with, let's call it a certain form of publicness that is really more about publicity than public engagement, right? I think one of the things that radical love could potentially do is to try to transform celebrity culture into celebration culture, which is to say, not to commodify and commercialize distinctiveness, right? But to say, well, what happens if we celebrate our actual humanity? What happens?
Human beings.
Human beings, as opposed to, That's right. And that's hard work, right? It's
having fun.
Having fun, having joy, making space for joy.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an enormous part of radical love, right? Is to make space for things like joy, laughter, tears, right? I mean, how does one really love if you don't have space or time or presence for laughter and joy and tears? Again, this is about real humanity. And it's about reaffirming let's call it a quality of humanity that doesn't get the airtime that it ought to, right?
And you spend a lot of time in the course going back to the traditions, the collective memories that almost disappear, that need to be resuscitated so that the new generation can realize their own needs were questioned by a previous generation.
Yeah, but traditions are only meaningful if they're one's actual traditions, right? And so, I do this with my students a lot, where I say to them, you have to interrogate where your people came from, right? That's not to say that, we're beholden just to the traditions that our ancestors shaped. We may adopt new traditions. I find myself, deeply immersed in, we were talking about earlier, the Black freedom movement, right? That I feel very much a part of that tradition. But it's also to talk about tradition in an unself-conscious way.
Now, how did you come by that
The
feeling?
connection?
Because I, as
Yeah.
a secular Jew,
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
deeply connect with that. So,
Well, I
what
think
traditions?
sure. I think it's not so surprising for those of us on the left, where we're thinking like, where are the soul-filled regions and traditions from the left? And in at least in America,
In America, right?
in American life, the Black freedom tradition, was the prime architect of that, right? The prime purveyor of that. But I think when I came to the United States in the late '60s, right? As we were talking about before, highly racially charged time, highly and a confusing time for a Korean family to show up.
You came to New York?
No, to Rhode Island.
Rhode Island,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. And I went. My first elementary school was called Martin Luther King Elementary School, right? Opened, I think, 3 or 4 years after the assassination of King. Right? And so, that legacy was very much in the air.
Your family was fairly traditional, or?
So I like to say that my family is Confucian in its deep genealogy and in its practice, but also deeply Christian as well. And I tend to think of myself as I won't call myself a neo-Confucian, I'll call myself a New World Confucian, which is to say, I have deep investments and practices of reciprocity. I have deep investments and practices that are animated by a commitment to filial piety. The sense in which we have bonds and faithfulness, not just to our own, but to a broad network of folks, family, community, a sense of people, right? Even the cosmos, right? Even the cosmos. And that we maintain those networks through reciprocal actions, not an exchange of goods, but an exchange of our humanity. Right? My humanity is fulfilled insofar as I maintain a connection with someone like yourself.
So were you mainly in a Korean community?
When I was growing up?
Growing up, or was it?
No, it was very small. It was very small. There was a small Korean community there. But I think that also intensified, let's call it my racialization, right? Predominantly white culture, being in a relatively small minority there, and learning a lot about the ways in which one inhabits but also resists dominant whiteness from Black folks. Right? I found I learned a lot from Black friends, Black community, just about how to be in the world.
Right, but would you call yourself that typical?
No.
A young man. That's what I want. Yeah. Okay. So I was, because it's important.
I don't want to play on my own uniqueness, but I don't think I'm very typical.
No, but it's very important, obviously, for your own life, but for our larger discussion about how people can begin to identify with the other and learn and experience and really get close and open up.
But if you think about it this way, for me, Black culture was other, but it was something that I came to identify with. And then once you begin to identify with it, and other culture.
What do you identify with? I don't know. Swagger,
it's the music. The music, the sense of
thumbing their nose.
The sense of
the war and so on.
A purposeful indignation.
Purposeful, right? Good way.
Right?
Good way of putting it.
Right, a purposeful indignation.
Standing up.
Standing up, but also standing up in a way not merely to resist, not merely to thwart authority, right? But to assert and affirm oneself precisely when others are saying you are less than. Again, the structure and logic of racism.
Purposive.
Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Then maybe some of the white radicals who were more lost in that sense, or scrambling around for purpose, identification.
Well, look, I mean, I think
Yeah.
we all look for meaning.
Of course.
Right? We all look for meaning. And for me, there was and continues to be a particular meaningfulness in Black culture. Black literature, Black arts, Black music. But, in a way where I'm not saying, I consider myself a student of these things, right? And it's something that constitutes me, but in the ways in which, like, you're of a culture not in an abstract way, right? Where you're really trying to think, like, is this potentially a part of me, or is it already a part of me, right? So, just on appearance, you say, like, well, why would you, David Kim, this Korean American, identify with Black culture, right? You're saying, like, is this typical? Well, no, right? But, there are all sorts of folks, Asian American, Korean, otherwise, that have found tremendous inspiration in Black culture. I mean, whether it's in hip hop, whether it's in literature, these are, I guess, put it another way, the immigrant family that I came from, had a high priority on resourcefulness, right? And you were constantly looking for resources, right?
Yeah.
So, English was not my first language, right? We didn't speak English in my household until probably well after I was 5 years old, right? And so coming at quote unquote conventional American English in a broken way, right? Not in a fluid way. I wasn't going to look to white English American culture as my aspiration.
Would probably ridicule you in some ways.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So
Yeah. Probably still do.
That's their problem. That's their problem. Yeah, that's interesting. So there's got to be some sort of grappling with the issue of how this incredible energy can be expanded, broadened.
You mean around love?
Yeah, radical love. That's been throughout the course. I've been thinking about this so much and how it's just got to permeate the academy, the different disciplines, the religious world, the media, you name it.
Well, again, I think, the first task is to get people over the self-consciousness about talking about it, about talking about love. I have this experience a lot, right? Where so I'm writing this book on the public life of love, and so I'll have an exchange with somebody, and they'll say, "Oh, what are you writing about?" And I'll say, "Oh, I'm writing a book about the public life of love," and the person asking me will kind of sit up, and I can see in their faces and in their bodies that they're registering, like, "Oh, I didn't know I was interested in that." Right? There's this recognition that even though all of us need and want love, we don't talk about it as much as we might, right? It's not as available to us, right?
Well, as you're talking, I'm just thinking about Beatty, my wife, who does a show on Progressive Radio Network. She is a sex therapist, a psychotherapist.
Oh, and there you go.
And this is what she talks about, and you're absolutely right. There's a hunger to talk about relationship. It's not dealt with in the schools. It's not dealt with anywhere, hardly. And it's something that is so necessary and needed.
Oh yeah, I mean,
so resisted.
Yeah, well, you know this. I have two sons. One is 19, one is 16. And one of the great heartbreaks in watching them turn into young men is their sense in which they have to at least feign, like, oh, I don't want a hug, I don't want intimacy, I don't, I love you, Dad, but not, I can't say it in a sincere way, right? That's a certain kind of masculine macho culture that eschews a central part of who they are, and that says you have to downplay this way of being that made you and made your family and that you value.
So what do you say to them?
I say to them,
your father's teaching a course of regular. What's up, guys? Yeah.
Well, no, I actually you have to break them down in the sense Are
they shy or?
No, they're not shy. They're not shy kids at all. But you have to break them sense, like, you know what? Even though you find this embarrassing, all right, even though you find this uncomfortable, right, I'm going to sit with you in this discomfort and embarrassment long enough to remind you, that you're constituted and made by love, right? You were talking about confidence with your students earlier. It takes a lot of confidence to sit through and ride through people's embarrassment and self-consciousness. Right? I mean, I'm sure Bede and her radio show deals with this all the time.
Absolutely.
Right? You have to wait. You have to be patient, and say, I know
they're ready to talk.
Yeah,
about.
I know you. We're gonna get there, and it's gonna be awkward, right? Messy, right?
So, but we need it at every level, of course.
Sure.
At the highest levels politically, we don't get it. I mean, obviously,
Well, I think
Obama's opening up a little here. He's got a year to go, and he's finally beginning to talk, open up a little bit on crucial issues.
Well, I mean, but it's
we don't have that conversation.
We don't have that conversation,
Anywhere.
we're not necessarily predisposed to believe people, right? Right. I mean, at this point, if Obama started talking about love, and political and public love, I don't know that even someone like myself would believe him.
The cynicism.
Well, the cynicism is there, and also, so there it's a certain kind of risk-taking I have to undergo, and saying, well, I have to be open to the possibility that he actually might be sincere. Right? I mean, that's the other piece of this here, is that radical love requires a certain kind of sincerity of intention, but also a sincerity of reception, which is to say, you dispatch radical love with your full integrity. Not
through your change of policies.
Through your change of policies, through the ways in which we carry ourselves, through the ways in which we think, through the ways in which we speak, through the ways in which we express ourselves. Right, and we structure policies that are shaped by principles of compassion, shaped by principles of mercy, shaped by principles of generalized and scalable love, right? Yeah. Awe, wonder, those kinds of things, right? And ride through, again, the shame and the embarrassment of saying, well, why are we doing that in policy? Why are we doing that in public life?
It's the same discussion you're having with your sons.
That's right. That's right. And
that the social scientists need to have with themselves too.
Well, the social scientists do too, but so what is that reflective of? It's reflective of a need for maturity. Right? So as the father of these incredible boys, these young men, I have a few more years under my belt and a little more experience, and so it's actually on me generationally to say, you know what. Whatever discomfort you're experiencing, whatever discomfort and awkwardness you're experiencing between each other, I will ride this out, right? And I'll have to figure out ways to do this. You can do this on a policy level as well, right? Say that what kind of patience, what kind of long vision do we have to have such that policies of mercy, compassion, awe, joy, those things are operating.
What do you say, though, to students, and I have a number of them, who have children of their own and tough love? Mm-hmm. You need to hit them. You need to discipline. Oh, right. That's the only thing that's going to, and you do it out of love. Right. And say why? Yeah. Are there other ways?
Oh, of course there are.
Of course there are. But
of course there are. Yeah.
I get such blowback on that.
Well, but again, it's that it's so as my experience as a parent, frustration is a demon and a devil, right? Because it'll just get the better of you, and you'll end up doing things that you'll be ashamed of, but also that you're thinking like, who is that, right? It brings out this terrible dark side of us. And so much of parenting, so much of loving each other well, is to really focus on the ways in which you can thwart your frustrations and make it productive rather than destructive, right? Corporal punishment of a child is a short-term attempt at a solution, right? Like corporal punishment in general. Right?
Or a militaristic response.
Right.
Exactly the same mindset.
Right. it's not thinking of the full humanity of the ones that you're punishing.
Absolutely.
Right? And it's not thinking, well, so how am I actually going to live with this person? Right? How am I going to live with this child? How am I going to live with the enemy? Right? We incarcerate the enemy because we don't want to live with them. Right? We punish them severely with physical harm because we don't really care for them. Now, your own child, in a moment where you may raise your hand, you have to find the wherewithal to say, is this the kind of parent that I want to be? Is this the kind of world that I want to be where, this is the ready solution, right? Mm-hmm. As opposed to, again, patience, as opposed to tenderness.
So at so many different levels, this personal, cultural, economic, political, radical love can speak to our frustrations. And
it can potentially, right?
It can, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's what we've got to take from our, one of the many things we could take from this discussion, the need to do that, because there's very little other choice at this point.
No, I agree. And again, to end and think about this note, what might the world look like if we chose tenderness over anger? Right?
Absolutely.
What might the world look like if we chose patience over frustration? And, again, not for nothing, that's radical imagination as much as it is radical love.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, listen, David, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, Jim, for inviting me.
This has just been so terrific.
Yeah.
I'd like to conclude this evening's show, though, by drawing some comparisons between a rather sobering article I read just recently that appeared in the October 15th edition of The Atlantic. The article was entitled, "Spreading the Free Market Gospel: What's New and Interesting About the Koch brothers' Approach to Funding Academics?" And I want to compare that to a recent sermon given that was entitled "A Moral Movement for the Nation" by Reverend William Barber, who was president of the North Carolina NAACP and architect of the Forward Together Moral Mondays movement. In the face of a traumatized misery and catastrophic physical and spiritual pain experienced by the majority of humanity, the Atlantic article pointed to the billionaire Koch brothers and their strategy to use their vast network of philanthropic institutions to spread their views on economic freedom, views that led them to earn their billions, leading the private oil, chemical, and manufacturing conglomerate of Koch Industries. These are the same strategies and policies that created the hyper-greed and inequality they want to see continue and expand. As the article puts it, political success for the Koch brothers and their far-right agenda begins with reaching young minds and souls in college lecture halls, thereby preparing these students to one day occupy the halls of political power. Their giving focuses on an ideological approach to free market economy in a way that's distinctive among political mega donors. Koch officials routinely cultivate relationships with professors and deans and fund specific courses of economic study pitched by them. The Koch network is fully integrated, so it's not just work at the universities with the students, but it's also building state-based capabilities and election capabilities and integrating this talent pipeline. No one else has this infrastructure. And a key Koch aide is quoted as saying, understandably from their perspective, "We're so excited about doing this." The radical greed of the Koch brothers and their free market gospel is just one manifestation of a self-absorbed mendacity and narcissism that pervades America. Radical love's answer to this catastrophic nihilism and incapacity to truly love resounds in Reverend Barber's sermon at Judson Memorial Church. And I'll briefly summarize and paraphrase that beautiful sermon. I looked for someone to stand up for me against all of this injustice, to repair all of the defenses of the city. I looked for someone to take a stand for me, to stand in the gap, to protect the land, and I could not find anyone, not one. All the technology, power, and money cannot bring safety and peace ultimately. I want you to understand the pain of those who are poor and those who are hurting and those who've been oppressed, because you cannot be some person who just makes a job out of speaking for people because you read a couple of statistics, because you really don't love the people, because you go wherever the grant goes. This is like today when people call war peace. That's a lie. Or we call self-interest generosity. Or we call greed opportunity. We call brutality national interest. And we call exploitation the free market. We just lie and lie and lie. We need a language, a moral language that reclaims the language of love and liberty and light and justice and the common good, and says that anything less than words and actions that follow that language is a weak, anemic, hellish, brutal form of pretentious democracy. Then and only then will we stand in the power of his love. Thank you, David, so much for your radical love, your kindness and friendship, your humanity, and thank you all for joining us again on The Radical Imagination. See you next Sunday at 8 p.m. when our guest will be Larry Cox, the former Executive Director of Amnesty International and co-founder of the Poverty Initiative. Be well and imagine how to love radically.